Welcome back again. This is Rabbi Jeff Saks of Web Yeshiva with another installment of our History of Halacha in 100 Objects. And how could we not but focus our attention tonight on the Hannukiah menorah. When I was a kid growing up, this object, which in 5 nights from now we're going to start lighting for Hanukkah, which begins on Sunday evening, we called it a menorah or a Hannukiah menorah. Although here in Israel, in contemporary Hebrew, it's just as often called a Hannukiah. I don't know, those of you that are in other locations, you can tell me if what's the common turn of phrase. I suspect outside of Israel it's still customarily called a menorah. The phrase in Hebrew might be to distinguish the Hanukkah menorah, the candelabrum for the Feast of Lights, from the Menorah HaMikdash, here seen in the famous Arch of Titus in Rome, which depicts what at least some artists in antiquity thought was the shape of the menorah in Jerusalem. The key difference between our Hanukkah menorah and the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, whether it looked exactly like depicted here or perhaps something like this, according to different shitot and Rishonim about the shape of the menorah, is of course the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash had 7 branches, and the menorah of Hanukkah has, of course, 8 plus 1 branch, the 8 spaces for the 8 candles, the 8 nights of Hanukkah, moving, according to our practice, from 1 candle the first night, 2 candles the second night, up to 8 candles on the final night, plus a 9th space for the shamash. Now, I'm not going to okay, good. I'm not going to now review all of the pertinent halachot of the Hanukkah menorah, although it is worthwhile, praiseworthy, and admirable to do so before Hanukkah, and I advise you to do that. As a matter of fact, on the WebYeshiva Facebook page, as well as on the WebYeshiva blog and on the WebYeshiva YouTube channel, you can catch a whole series of practical halacha shiurim from Rabbi Bravender, little snippets of little halachic lessons on the laws of the Hanukkah menorah, which we are this week leading up to Hanukkah replaying and rebroadcasting. I trust that the essential laws of the Hanukkah menorah are known to people, and if anybody has any specific questions, we can talk about that as we get closer to the end, or you can chat in or ask your specific questions. But I wanted to focus on a particularly interesting tshuva about the electric Hannukiah. Now, this image that you see on the screen, a plug-in Hanukkah with 8 plus 1 light bulbs, which are seen all over the place, either in this at-home model or here in Israel, it's quite common that on public buildings, in my town in Efrat, on top of the city hall, as it were, which also doubles as a shopping center, is a large electric menorah, which is lit the 8 nights of Hanukkah with 8 different candles. Chabad, Lubavitch, puts out all over the country at intersections and elsewhere large electric menorot or Hanukkiot, which are lit during the holiday. What is the status of these objects? Of course, we know that the mitzvah of lighting the Hanukkah candles is to light oil or to light candles. But what is the status of these electric bulbs and an electric Hanukkiah? So interestingly enough, this is the topic of a variety of tshuvot in the modern poskim. Of course, nobody prior to Thomas Edison deals with this question, although earlier poskim did deal with conceptually similar ideas which have bearing on this very modern question. And the issue was taken up by Rav Ovadia Yosef Zatzal, who was, of course, a colossally important figure in the world of halacha, in the world of Torah, in the world of politics, as the spiritual leader of the Shas political party here in Israel, as a former Sephardic chief rabbi of the state of Israel, but first and foremost as a posek of very severe, significant, I should say, very significant importance. He passed away just 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. And he left behind, of course, most importantly, a whole variety of svarim and teachings. The tshuva, which is available, you can download the whole tshuva from our website, from the shir page, as a PDF. But the tshuva that we're going to be looking at parts of tonight is found in his collection called Yechave Da'at. He has two major sets of she'elot utshuvot, responsa. He has the larger and much more in-depth series called the Yabia Omer, and he has the shorter, more concise set of tshuvot called the Yechave Dat. Many of the tshuvot in this series are emanate from a radio program that he used to do, where people would call into the radio. He did a live program. People would call in with their halachic questions, and he would answer them on the spot without any advanced preparation, not knowing what the questions were going to be as they came in. And it was an opportunity to demonstrate his colossal erudition, his complete command of the sources. And if you read through the short tshuva, the tshuvot in Yechave Dat are not terribly long, and they also have the virtue of very succinctly summarizing up front the question and very succinctly summarizing the conclusion at the end, so that people that are working their way through the Yechave Dat can really get a scope and sense of the topics he's dealing with and the direction he's going. Although it should not be confused for the fashion today of what they call the shoot SMS, these very short lightning rounds, 140-character questions and answers that people can text in on their phones to a variety of rabbonim and get a very quick, immediate answer. And I suppose there are certain questions, to which a very short, quick, immediate answer is a good one. There are certain questions that no responsible rabbi, teacher, or post-take would answer over SMSs, and I suppose wisdom is the difference knowing the difference between the two. But the Yechave Dat does have these kinds of bottom line summaries, which are sometimes just interesting to browse your way through. It's important before we look at the tshuva to see this little passage from the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch in Aruch Chaim, Hilchot Hannukiah, Siman Tafresh Ayin Gimel, says, Kol hashmanim v'haptilot ksherim l'ner Hanukkah. All types of oils and all types of wicks are kasher, are proper, are fitting for lighting the Hanukkah candles or oils or wicks. This is important, of course, because as you know from our often repeated repetition of the Bama Madlikin Mishnayot on Leil Shabbat, not all types of oils and wicks are acceptable for Shabbat candles. And that has to do with certain things related to the laws of Shabbat. But the Shulchan Aruch says all oils and all wicks are kasher for Hanukkah. Af al pi she'ein hashmanim nimshachim achar haptila ve'ein ha'or nitle yafeh botam haptilot. Even though in certain wicks and certain oils, the flame doesn't burn steadily and clearly and is not always pulled up along the wick in a kind of constant stream, leaving for a more kind of flickery light, things which are seriously undesirable on Shabbat for fear that a person will adjust the lights in violation of Shabbat. But all of these things, although they may not be ideal for Hanukkah candles, they are in fact kasher, and one who lights his Hannukiah, his Menorah for Hanukkah with these less desirable fuels and wicks fulfills the mitzvah of Hanukkah. Hago, however, the Ramo, Rav Moshe Isserlis, the great Ashkenazic addender to the Shulchan Aruch, adds, Umihu shemen zayit mitzvah min hamuvchar. However, The ideal way of performing the mitzvah is with olive oil. Why might olive oil be the preferable way to do it? What do you think? No. Correct, as everybody points out, because it most closely recalls and commemorates the Menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, whose lighting during the original Hanukkah was the cause of the miracle and the thing which we are commemorating through the mitzvah. Even though all oils and wicks are possible, it is preferable to use olive oil. And if shemen zayit is not available, if olive oil is not available, which was the case in many of the Jewish diasporas in different parts of the world, not all Jews lived in the Mediterranean basin where olive trees and olive oil were readily available, and people who lived in parts of Northern Europe or Russia or elsewhere, olive oil was not readily available, certainly not at an easily affordable price. So if olive oil is not readily available, mitzvah b'shmanim she'oran zach v'naki. So one should use an oil that burns clear and bright. V'noagim b'menediniot elu lahadlik b'ner shel she'ava. And in our countries, in the Eastern European countries, he means in what we call Poland, the widespread custom was to use wax candles. And when we were kids, of course, lighting Hanukkah candles meant lighting Hanukkah candles. That box of multicolored, it looked like a box of Crayola crayons. Those were Hanukkah candles. I'm sure if you Google right now Hanukkah candles, you'll immediately find the right picture that we're talking about. Ki oran salul kemo shemen. And the reason that candles are universally used as the widespread minhag in Poland is because they give a nice, clean, bright, steady flame like that of oil, even though they are not oil. Now, of course, oil lamps and wax candles essentially are doing the same thing, providing a fuel source, either solidified wax, which melts through the heat of the flame and serves as the fuel, or liquid oil, like olive oil or any other type of oil that burns, through the medium of a wick that holds the flame and pulls the fuel up the wick to burn. The mechanics of it, the physics of it, are essentially the same. This is what the Shulchan Aruch says. Now let's look at Rav Ovadia Yosef in the Yechave Dat, Chelek Daled, Volume 4, Chapter 38, Siman Lamed Chet. And here's the question. She'ila. Ha'im yecholim letzet yedei chovat hadlakat neirot Chanukah al yedei hadlakat Hannukiah chashmalit? Can one fulfill the mitzvah by lighting, or I guess turning on, an electric menorah? And then the questioner goes on to ask, Ha'im al kol panim rishayim levarech bebeit knesset al hadlakat Hannukiah chashmalit shemi'ira yafa. Shemi'ira yafa. Can one nevertheless recite the blessings in the Beit Knesset over an electric menorah that gives off a nice light? Now, there is this custom to light the Hanukkah candles in shul. Even though everyone lights the candles at home, there's a custom to light the candles in shul after Ma'ariv, and also, again, to light them in the morning without a blessing, but at night to light the Hanukkah candles in the shul when everyone is present, and to recite a blessing on them, even though no one fulfills their obligation through reciting, through through the lighting of the candles in the Beit Knesset, in the synagogue. Nevertheless, the bracha is recited. Because what happens is people go to shul and they daven Mariv, which takes just a few minutes, and then everybody rushes out. Shuls don't like the idea of leaving lit candles laying around. It's a fire hazard. Building, nobody's there. So the possibility to light an electric menorah certainly obviates those fears. So the question is asking, can we say the blessings over such a menorah in a shul? In all cases, no one is fulfilling their obligation through it. Would it do the job? And here is the tshuva. Here is his answer. The Gemara in I'll give a loose translation and summary of much of it, and then we'll look at some of it inside. The Gemara in Masechet Shabbat says that all oils and all wicks that are forbidden on Shabbat because they don't produce the right kind of light. And because they don't produce the right kind of light, there's a fear that on Shabbat someone will try to adjust the wick in order to get the flame to be steady. That all of those oils that are not allowed on Shabbat because they don't produce a good quality light can be lit on Hanukkah, and this is the opinion of the Rambam, and this is what the Rambam says. That is, in fact, the word for word what we saw in the later source in the Shulchan Aruch, and in fact, Rabbi Yosef says, and this is the opinion of the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch. This is the passage that we just looked at moments ago, and now we've traced it back from the Shulchan Aruch, backwards to the Tur, backwards to the Rambam, backwards to the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. And of course, it's important to remember there is no tractate in the Talmud about Hanukkah, but the laws of Hanukkah are largely contained in Masechet Shabbat, piggybacked to the laws of candle lighting for Shabbat. Wait, did I say that correctly? The laws of Hanukkah candles are found in Masechet Shabbat, piggybacked to the laws of Shabbat candles. V'lich'ora, it seems, it should be, says Rabbi Yosef, nira shehu hadin sheyotzim yidei chova b'chanukiah chashmalit. So just like the Gemara and the Rambam and the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch all say that the lights which cannot be used on Shabbat can be used on Hanukkah. So it could be, take note of the tone in my voice, maybe that an electric menorah would also do the trick. B'frat shehi me'ira yafeh v'yesh ba hidur le'mitzvat ner Hanukkah. It could be that an electric menorah lights up very nicely and, in fact, enhances the mitzvah of Hanukkah. What is the essential mitzvah of Hanukkah? What are we really trying to accomplish through the mitzvah of Hanukkah candles? Yes, pirsu, what we call in Hebrew pirsume nisa, or publicizing the miracle, telling the miracle, that it somehow captures something of what happened in the Beit HaMikdash. It symbolizes, it encapsulates it, and therefore, in theory, an electric Hannukiah, again, we're speculating, hypothetically, an electric Hannukiah might be able to do that trick. V'chein pasak Harav Hagon Rav Yosef Mashash. Rav Yosef Mashash was the chief rabbi of Haifa. He died in 1974. So he in fact speculated that an electric menorah would do the trick. Va'amnam Hagon Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkis. Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkis died in 1905. He was an important Galician rabbi, a Rav from Galicia. He was the Rav in Lvov, which is Lemberg today in the Ukraine. He wrote a collection of Sheilot or Tshuvot of responses called the Beit Yitzchak. And in the Beit Yitzchak, he says, She'ein yotzin yedei chovat ner Chanukah, lo begaz v'lo bechashmal. That you cannot fulfill your Hanukkah obligations with neither an electric Hannukiah nor a Hannukiah that would be attached, let's say, to the gas line. And you would light the gas that would come up through the gas line. Mipnei shehadlakat shemen zayit hi mitzvah min hamufchar. Since the proper way, the ideal way, is to light with olive oil, Kemoshe pasak harama, that's the Rama that we just saw. Va'od shemikevan shasuyim heim lahadlik laha'ir b'chol yemot hashana ein bahem mishum prisumei nisa. And since we light electric lights all the time, and he was writing this sometime at the end of the 19th century, when electric lighting was less omnipresent as it is today, but even then he said, since we use electric lighting or gas lighting all the time, there won't be anything distinct about our electric lights, an electric lit Hanukkiah. And part of what generates the Prisumei Nisa is, the publicizing the miracle, is the specialness, the uniqueness of it. V'ke'ein ma shekatav harama she'yizharu shelo lahadlik neirot Chanukah b'makom she'madlikim neirot b'chol neirot tamid b'chol yemot hashana. The Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch, not the passage that we saw, later in Tafresh Ayin Aleph Siman Zayin, the Ramah says that one shouldn't light his Hanukkah candles in the same location in the house where he lights his candles all year long. He's not here talking about his Shabbat candles per se, but at night when it got dark, you would light candles. People had a candelabrum hanging from the middle of the ceiling, or an oil dish that hung from the middle of the ceiling that would be lit, or there'd be other places in the house where candles or oil would be lit in order to illuminate the house in the evening. So the Hanukkah candles should not be lit where the year-long candles are lit, because they won't be distinct. You won't realize that they're being lit for Prisumei Nisa for Hanukkah. They will be mistaken for your day-in, day-out, year-round candles, and therefore they will not perform their function of advertising anything. So Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkis suggests that similarly you can't use an electric menorah, since we're so accustomed to lighting electric lights all the time. Lighting an electric menorah will be overlooked because of this problem that the Ramah suggests. And therefore, one should not recite the blessings over electric menorot, and presumably one does not fulfill his obligation. Ad kan tokef dvaro. So up until now, he's been quoting the opinion of Rav Yitzchak Shmelkis about why you cannot, against Rav Mashash, why you cannot light an electric menorah. However, says Rav Avadia Yosef, it's not so clear to me. So first of all, he said you can't use an electric menorah since the proper way of doing it is with olive oil. So he says it's true that the best way of doing it is with olive oil, but it's not the exclusive way. And somebody that lights with any other oil fulfills the obligation. Somebody that lights with wax candles fulfills the obligation. You can't discount an electric menorah because it's not olive oil, when in fact, as we saw in the Gemara, as we saw in the Rambam, as we saw in the Torah and in the Shulchan Aruch, all types of oil and all types of candles are effective in doing the mitzvah, even though there's a halachic preference for olive oil. And a gas light or an electric light, in theory, should also be good. It's also been stated in Masechet Horiot, Nehi delokai avid mitzvah min hamufchar pesach mihu ka'achil. That even if you don't, we have a principle that even though, in many mitzvot, there's an ideal way of doing things. We have an idea of lechatchila, of min hamufchar, the preferable way of doing it. But that doesn't mean that other acceptable ways are invalid. There are certain things that are invalid. If you take a lemon instead of an etrog for lulav and etrog, you have not fulfilled your obligation, because a lemon is not merely a less good form of etrog. It's not an etrog at all, and you can't fulfill your obligation with it. The best way to light Hanukkah candles is with olive oil, but any other type of fuel is acceptable. And as for his second reason, eino mukrach, it's not a showstopper, because in the old days, remember, his second reason was you can't use electric lights for Hanukkah, since we use electric lights all year long, and it won't be distinct that you're doing it for Hanukkah, as the Ramah had taught us to light the Hanukkah candles in a different place in order to preserve their distinctness from the year-round candles. So Rabbi Yosef says, in the days of old, Zman Avotenu, Va'avot Avotenu, in our grandparents and great-grandparents, all of the lights were with oil lamps before electricity. Once upon a time, all lamps were oil lamps. But when it came time to light Hanukkah candles, they lit oil lamps. So nobody said that when they lit oil lamps for Hanukkah, they didn't fulfill the mitzvah of Hanukkah, because all year long they were lighting oil lamps to see by. So this idea of the importance of making the Hanukkah candles distinct is not, it can't be that it invalidates lighting an electric menorah because we use electricity all the time for our lighting. That being said, I will add in parentheses a point that is raised in the Beit Yitzchak. Technically speaking, one does not need a menorah, a candelabrum, one of these fancy things made out of metal or made out of wood or made out of clay or made out of ceramic or whatever these things are that you fix the candles into, although it's a universal custom. If one, many times you see this if people are traveling, or sometimes yeshiva students that are on a budget and are away from home, or things like that, they'll take these little ski lamps, these little candles, these long burning candles in these little metal jackets, and they'll just line them up on a piece of tin foil. And the first night they'll light one and have a shamash on the side, and the second night they'll just place two and then three. One certainly fulfills their obligation of lighting Hanukkah candles in this way. However, there is an opinion, which the Maharal of Prague, who has a lovely book called Ner Mitzvah on the mitzvah of Hanukkah and Hanukkah in general as a holiday in Jewish thought, where he points out the idea that it is preferable to light the Hanukkah lights in a menorah, in a vessel that holds all of has spots for all 8 candles, and each night you add one, because that is what creates a sense of distinction. That when you, even though on the first night you have 8 plus 1 spots in the Hannukiah, I could pull down any number of Hanukkiot from the shelves, but you know what they look like. But the fact that you're lighting it in this ritual object, and that is the theme of our whole series here, which are the tashmishei mitzvah and the tashmishei kedusha, the Jewish mitzvah ritual objects, that somehow creates this distinction. Even many people have this practice of lighting. They have little shot glasses that they line up and they fill with oil in the wicks, the floating wicks or the stand-up wicks, and they light in those. That certainly one fulfills his obligation, but yet according to this opinion of the Maharal, it is preferable to have again, what we call a menorah or a Hannukiah that kind of binds it all together, holds it all together. The specific dinim, the specific laws of what a Hannukiah should look like, as I mentioned, we're not covering, but suffice it to say that not every Hannukiah that you can buy in a Judaica shop fulfills the letter of the law or the spirit of the law. Among the requirements for Hannukiah is that the candles should all be in a collinear and coplanar, in a straight line across. And sometimes you see very decorative, beautiful menorot that have the 8 candles in a circle, or up and down on different kinds of steps, or zigzagged in or out, or things like that. This is, depending upon the shape of the menorah, either certainly not ideal, or in some cases not kasher. So the fact that a Hannukiah or menorah might be sold in a local Judaica shop does not inherently mean that it is the best or even the possible way of fulfilling the mitzvah. So going back to our point about the electric candles and being unique, וזאת גם בזמן שהיו מדליקים נרות חנוכה מבפנים, והיה די בשינוי מקום של נרות חנוכה. In the days of medieval ages, when Hanukkah candles were almost universally lit indoors, as they are in many places today, so in all cases, people who light their Chanukiot outdoors or in the doorway of their homes, so that is certainly unique, because that is not a place where people light candles normally throughout the year. But in the medieval times, when it wasn't always possible to light your candles out of doors in a public way because of our sometimes difficult relationships with our non-Jewish neighbors, and the candles had to be lit inside, וגם דבר זה אינו לעיכוב שגם הרמה תפס כן רק בלשון של זהורית, when they would light indoors, so they would just light in a different spot, in a different location, in order to make it distinct. And even that was not me'akev, it didn't prevent. If you lit your Hanukkah candles on the very same spot or stand or table that you light your Shabbos candles all year long, or where you would light your nightly oil lamp in order to see and read by in your house, you fulfilled your obligation, even though you didn't do so in the ideal way. And if, in fact, as I mentioned, says Rabbi Yosef, you do the better way, and you have a specific Hanukkah menorah, not just lining up candles in a row, so that lighting the Hanukkah candles in that Hanukkah menorah itself signifies that you are doing this for the purpose of Pesumei Nisa, and you can't confuse it for a regular day in, day out candle, because you don't light candles in a candle holder like that. It screams of being distinct for Hanukkah. Shahare yesh heker gamur bahadlakatash naset l'shem mitzvah. It will be obvious that you're doing it for the purpose of Hanukkah candles if you light the candles in the Hanukkah menorah, kemoshe katav pri chadash, etc. So he seems to be taking apart the objections to lighting an electric menorah. Ulam, however, we have to say the truth. Until now, we've only been speaking theoretically. There is, in fact, a reason that we do not fulfill our obligation through lighting an electric menorah. And that is because in electric menorah, there is neither oil nor a wick. And the miracle occurred in the temple menorah with shemen, with oil. Shelo haya bala hadlikela yom echad. And there was not enough to light for one day, and a miracle occurred, and it lit for 7 days. And the mitzvah today of Hanukkah is to recreate that in a way that is reminiscent of the miracle that occurred. But an electric menorah does not contain oil, and therefore it is lacking in tashmishei. The electric menorah, or a gas menorah, is lacking in that sense of finite fuel supply, because the fuel, quote unquote, the electricity or the gas coming from some central supply is not contained there in the candle, in the cup of oil, and that is the reminiscence of the miracle. That is the tashmishei. He points out that the Baal Hamor of Zrachi Halevi, who was a 13th century Rishon, writes that the reason that we cannot make use of the Hanukkah candles, like we say in the Hanerot Halalu, that little piyut that we say immediately after lighting the candles, Ein lanu reshut lehishtamesh bohem ela lirotam bilvad. That's why we light the shamash. We can't derive any benefit or use out of the light of the candles, so we light an extra candle, the shamash, so that if we do get any use out of the candles, we assume that it's coming from the permitted light of the shamash, because they are a commemoration of the miracle of the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. Shelo haya b'shemen kedei lahadlik ela laila echad bilvad, naseh bo nes v'hidlik shmona leilot. There was only candles light for enough for one night. They lasted for 8 nights. Therefore, we take no benefit or use. You're not permitted to read by the light of the Hannukiah or do anything else of the Hannukiah, because that was the case in the Beit HaMikdash. That was the case in the Beit HaMikdash. Since the light of the temple menorah was holy, it was there in order to illuminate the Beit HaMikdash, but no secular use of the lights could be used. And then he points out an electric light, which is not conceptually similar to the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, because it's lacking both oil and wick. So therefore, for that reason, because of the conceptual difference from how it works, one should not be allowed to fulfill his obligations of Hanukkah with an electric menorah. And then he brings a long list of poskim, which I've excised here. You can see the whole list in the full tshuva of other poskim that have come to the same conclusion. That according to the Rashba and the Ran, that Hanukkah candles are like the candles have the same stature as the Beit HaMikdash candles, so you can't fulfill your obligation with gas lights because they have no wick. The gas burns off of the gas that comes out of the pipe, and it's lacking a wick. And the electric candles are lacking because the fuel is not contained there in the immediate presence. So because of the conceptual differences between gas and between electricity, they are invalid for the purposes of Hanukkah. He points out that Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, who was the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim in the beginning of the 20th century, says, for these reasons, quoting the Rogatchover, that nevertheless, שנוסח הברכה להדליק נר של שבת או של חנוכה לא שייך בהדלקת חשמל, שלחיצת כפתור אינו בסוג מדליק. There's another problem that flipping a switch is not exactly the same as kindling a light, and that's another difference that should set us apart. I won't get into here, but you should just be aware the question of electric lighting and different types of lights and incandescent lights and fluorescent lights and these new what do they call those green lights, those kind of squirrely lights. I'm forgetting the word. Yeah, no, not LEDs, but those also. So the question of electric lights in Halacha is a large and complicated one. And if one Googles this topic, you will find more than enough resources to fill you in. But obviously, we are careful not to use electric lights on Shabbat, to turn electric lights off and on Shabbat. And in the absence of the ability to light candles, many poskim do allow turning on incandescent lights, lights with a glowing filament as a substitute for Shabbat candles. But that is a topic for a different subject. But then Rav Yosef says this is not all absolutely clear, and Rav Yitzchak Shmelkis, who we mentioned earlier, Pshitale Ipcha Shefshar Varech Ladig Ner Shel Shabbat or Shel Chanukah Al Ner Chashmal. V'nireh she'im ein lo nerot Chanukah haksherim lahadlaka ela menorat chashmal bilvad yadlikenu blo bracha. So now, and here you see Rav Avadia's kind of sensibilities at work. He says, look, we should not light electric Chanukiot, because it is not the proper or ideal way of going about the mitzvah. However, if you find yourself with no other option but to light an electric Hannukiah, you can do so. You should not recite the blessing, because after all, the blessings on the mitzvot that we say, Asher kedushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, lahadlik ner shel Chanukah, likboa mezuzah, lahaniach tefillin, any leishe basukah, etc., etc., the mitzvot that we recite are not ma'akev. If someone performs a mitzvah without reciting the bracha, but has intent to do the mitzvah, he fulfills the mitzvah. He has not fulfilled the obligation of the rabbinic obligation of reciting a bracha. So there are times where we're kind of caught betwixt and between, where you can't fulfill the mitzvah in the ideal way. But maybe there's a way to do it according to a minority opinion. You should do it in that way if you have no other choice, but not say a bracha, in deference to the majority opinion that say this is not the way to do it. So let me see, what is this? So Aryeh asks a question which is raised by other poskim. If in the case of the electric light, it has to do with a situational or an engineering problem, not an intrinsic one, one could easily create an obvious battery that would supply sufficient charge for the given night's candles, even with each electric bulb floating in its own electrolytic solution. I'm not sure what that is. Further, one could actually connect a wire, one per light, in order to light, making it similar in hand motion to lighting candles. Yes, it is absolutely possible to do that. And in fact, what do we do if you have to travel on an airplane, as sometimes happens, and it's Hanukkah, and you're taking the flight that leaves New York before sunset, and you spend the whole night on the airplane, and by the time you land in Tel Aviv, it's already the next morning, so you've missed the opportunity to light the candles. So if you have like a flashlight, which has a built-in finite fuel source, similar to a cup full of oil with a wick, so you turn it on, you don't say a bracha. You certainly don't say Shemu Malchut, God's holy names. But you can have in mind, because obviously they don't allow you to light candles on the airplane. In other circumstances, we can imagine in times of war or in times of other scenarios, where that would be the case. So one can and should rely on Rav Avadia's opinion. He goes on to discuss here the topic of the answer to the second question about lighting Hanukkiot, public Hanukkiot, the virtue, the value of lighting these large electric Hanukkiot, these decorative Hanukkiot in public spaces, as I said, on top of the supermarket here in Efrat, and whether or not one could recite the Birkat Hariyah. Now, you know, we do not, we say a variety of brachot. We say the Birkat HaMitzvah, the operative mitzvah blessing, which has the phraseology, Asher Kiddushanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu. All Birkot HaMitzvah have that phraseology, who has commanded us with the commandments, sanctified us with the commandments, and commanded us to fill in the blank. Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah. And then we recite an additional bracha. That additional bracha is not a Birkat HaMitzvah, but is what's called a Birkat Ri'iyah V'hoda'ah. She'asa nisim la'avotenu bayamim ha'hem bazman hazeh. That God did miracles. Please note the phrasing of the bracha. Not as many people think. Many people recite She'asa nisim la'avotenu bayamim ha'hem uvizman hazeh. That is a mistake. We are not saying who did miracles for our forefathers in those days and in our time. He did miracles then for them, and he does miracles today for us. That is not the meaning of the bracha. The meaning of the bracha is She'asa nisim lavotenu, who did miracles for our forefathers, bayamim ohem, in those days, bazman hazeh, at this time of the year, on the 25th of Kislev. That's the meaning of Shasa Nisim Lavotenu Bayamim Mohem Bazman Hazeh. On Yud Dalid Ba'adar, on the 14th of Adar, is Purim. In those days, at this time, on this date. Right? That's what the bracha is. Not that he did the miracles for them and he does it for us. He does miracles for us, but that's not what the meaning of the bracha is. Someone who can't light their own Hanukah menorah for whatever reason, but is passing along and sees someone else's menorah, so he can't say the bracha of Asher Kiddushanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah because he's not lighting a Hanukah menorah, but he can recite the Birkat Ri'iyah, the blessing that is recited upon seeing the Hanukkiah, because he sees someone else's Hanukkiah. So Rav Avadia evaluates this question. Someone who isn't lighting their own Hanukkiah, and it will not be lighting their own Hanukkiah, and doesn't have somebody lighting a Hanukkiah for them, but he sees an electric menorah in the shopping center, can he recite that Birkat Ri'iyah? And he brings some evidence to really suggest that we can, although his conclusion essentially is that we don't do that, but nevertheless, quoting Rav Uziel, who had been the first Sephardic chief rabbi of the state of Israel, Rav Avadia's predecessor, says, Mikol makom rashai haroeh levarech sha'as hanisim bli shem u'malchut. But he can recite the bracha without uttering God's name, meaning he can say the bracha, but not in the normal formula, for fear of uttering God's name in a case where the bracha should not be recited. So he would say, Baruch atah sha'as hanisim lavotenu bayemim ohim bazman hazeh. Kind of fulfilling the spirit of the bracha, if not technically reciting the bracha itself. And then in conclusion, here you see sikum. This is the conclusion. This is the last paragraph of the tshuva, where he sums it all up. Ein yotzim yedei chovat mitzvat hadlaket nerot Hannukiah al yedei hadlakat Hannukiah chashmalit. One does not fulfill his obligation through lighting an electric menorah. Ve'im ein lo ner Hannukiah acher ela menorat chashmal bilvad yadlikenu b'lo bracha. Nevertheless, if his only option is to light an electric menorah, he should do so, but he should not recite the blessing. Ve'im achar kach yizdamen lo ner Hannukiah hakasher lahadlaka yadlikenu b'bracha. And if his luck should change, if he should subsequently to lighting the electric menorah find the ability to light a proper gas or a proper candle or oil menorah, he should do so with a blessing. And in the synagogue, one should not say a blessing on an electric menorah, even though he had speculated on why that would be easier to be lenient about. But the bottom line is, even in the synagogue, where you're not properly fulfilling anyone's obligation, we light through the custom of a minhag, through the force of minhag, but we do say a blessing in the synagogue. Nevertheless, one should not say the blessing of an electric menorah, and one who sees an electric menorah burning on the roof of a synagogue or some other place like the shopping center should not say the bracha of Sha'as hanisim lavotenu, even if he doesn't have the ability to light his own Hannukiah and recite the blessings. And even if no one else is lighting on his behalf, but nevertheless, it raises the question of the value of these things. Since no one fulfills their obligation with these large electric menorot, why do we do it? Well, it's hard to say that it doesn't promote the spirit of Pirsumei Nisa, but it raises the topic that we've touched on in the past of the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, and the halachic agenda of creating ritual through ritual objects that become the definitive channel for performing a mitzvah. One can recite the words of kiddush and perhaps even fulfill Torah obligations to remember the Sabbath day. But until he's taken a cup of wine, or she's taken a cup of wine that fulfills all of those ritual obligations that we discussed a few weeks ago, and recites the set text, she has not fulfilled his or her obligations of reciting kiddush, at least not as defined rabbinically. One can remember the Exodus from Egypt all day long, talk about it day and night. But unless one has put on the tefillin or affixed a proper mezuzah to their door frame, which are aimed at creating a memory of the Exodus from Egypt, he has not fulfilled those obligations. A big electric Hannukiah that Chabad places in the major thoroughfares that tens and hundreds of thousands of people see reminds them that tonight is Hanukkah. Reminds us of the story, has great virtue, just like all educational projects. Somebody gives a shiur on Hanukkah that reminds people about the Chashmonayim and the Yevanim and everything else. That's a different form of Pirsumei Nisa, but it is not the mitzvah of Pirsumei Nisa mandated by the rabbis to be fulfilled through the lighting of the menorah. So there's the spirit of the law and there's the letter of the law. And we don't denigrate the spirit of the law. It informs the letter of the law. But alternate channeling of spirits of the law do not obviate us from our obligations to still be loyal to the letter of the law. And I think that tension is played out here in the tshuva of Rav Ovadia Yosef, that great 20th century posek. It's important to remember his role, which sadly has been overshadowed by his involvement in Israeli politics to a certain degree, or at least in certain circles, and the sensitivity that he brought to these topics, this one not being one of the major complex halachic issues that he dealt with, but an interesting one for us a few days before Hannukkah. Next week on Hanukah itself, next Tuesday night, we will not be meeting because of the festival obligations that we will each be having, including this important mitzvah object, the eating of sufganiot. And perhaps on some occasion in the future we can talk about achilat sufganiot kehilchatan, the proper method of eating fried jelly donuts. But until then, I wish you a Chag Urim Sameach, happy Chanukah, and we will pick up again in 2 weeks. If anybody had any specific questions about the halachot of candle lighting, now is the time to ask.